Good evening. This is PESI, Political Economy Summer Institute 5, the fifth edition, and my name is Bassam Haddad. I direct the Middle East and Islamic program at George Mason University, and I'm involved in the Political Economy project. And I am extremely excited today to be introducing Professor Shireen Say Ali and Professor Kareem Rabie, who will have a conversation on Kareem Rabie's new book. And I will let Shireen Say Ali introduce the book. A couple of things I'd like to say, including that PESI is an ASI project of the Arab Studies Institute, co-sponsored by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University. And it is actually hosted at George Mason University for the past 5 years, and of course we had to skip last year because of COVID, but we're back this year and we are excited to be holding this edition. It's one of our more successful editions. We have upwards of 10 instructors and a dozen fellows, and we are now having our first and only public dimension of the Summer Institute, and very excited that Karim Rabia is joining us. After the conversation is over, we are asking our visitors, guests, and so on to field their questions on the Facebook page by writing question, like actually typing out question, and then adding the questions so that we can identify the questions as opposed to the commentary and so on. Shireen Sayali is going to field the questions, and Kareem is going to actually be our guest of honor, our main guest today. So I will leave this with the capable hands of Shireen. She will introduce Kareem and the book, and we will be on our way. Thank you, Shireen and Kareem, for joining us. I will actually now literally disappear.
Hi, Kareem. Uh, can you hear me?
I can hear you,
Awesome.
yes.
Okay. I'm so honored to be here with you, launching this amazing book that I've had the great privilege of seeing in different iterations. So, let me just first introduce our guest today. Kareem Rabia is assistant professor of anthropology at American University in Washington. He studies privatization, urban development, and the state building project in the West Bank. His first book, which we're really excited to talk about today, is titled Palestine is Throwing a Party and the Whole World is Invited. It came out in mid May from Duke University Press. And Kareem is going to be, or is now, I think, a visiting fellow at CUNY Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, right? And the Committee on Globalization and Social Change is something that he's also involved in. And previously, he was the Harper Schmidt Fellow at the University of Chicago and Marie Curie Fellow Senior Researcher at the Center on Migration Policy and Society at the University of Oxford. I think Kareem is one of the most exciting thinkers I know, so I'm very happy to be here and honored to be in conversation with you. I'm just going to open it up and ask you to talk about what is the party Palestine is inviting us to.
Well, it's first of all, I should say, Shadian, it's actually my honor to be in conversation with you. So thank you for agreeing to do this. Thanks to Samit and Bassam for inviting us both to do this, and for the and to the students and participants of the Summer Institute. I hope the past 2 days have been good, and I hope the next 2 days continue to be good. I knew you were going to ask this question, and I had sort of thought about an answer about what is the party that I'm inviting us to, and then I realized like it's not my party. I'm not inviting anybody to a party. But it's a good question, and it also requires me to explain the title, which is that I began the book with a little piece from the 2008 Palestine Investors Conference, which was this big project to bring investors to Palestine, to cultivate links, to cultivate international links and internal capital, to raise money for the private sector, and so on. It was this big conference that happened in the new Bethlehem Convention Center. I didn't go to the 2008 conference, but I went to the second Palestine Investment Conference. This was supposed to be an annual conference, but it happened in 2010. It was also the last conference. And it was from their documentation. There was a letter posted on the website written by the then Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, saying we are throwing a party and the whole world is invited. And I started there as a way to start to describe the things that I wanted to talk about in my research and the project in the book, which is, these projects of investment and privatization and stabilization, and the work that's being done to conceive and produce Palestine as open, malleable, and something that can be worked into some kind of a future shape. So my proposition is that a lot of these private development projects are, and the intertwined representations of them, so, talking about the party and then having the party, whatever it might be, have material impacts, and also that they have a spatial logic, which in my case lends itself to study. So, what I did was I studied various projects, but a large housing development project called Rabie north of Ramallah, and tried to sort of situate the analysis of all these things coming in. So, I want to say a couple words about how I think it's also, if we're talking about like the world part of the, who's invited, I think that you can see through these kinds of projects a kind of simultaneous shrinking and growing of Palestine. So I think that I situated the analysis in Ramallah because it's the place that's the target of a lot of interventions, this sort of representation of Palestine in a lot of ways, a representation of Palestine. We'll talk about that, I think, shortly, but also growing outwards towards sort of cultivating political economic links and so on. So I think the party that I'm referring to is these processes of cultivating international investment, getting people excited about their potential to make returns. That was language that I saw at the investment conference. People talking about the returns to be made in Palestine, but not in the register that we're accustomed to hearing Palestinians talk about return. So that's the party.
Okay, that's really enlightening, and I think also kind of leads to the next question, which is, I mean, just building on this question of returns and imagining what return is. And in the last month or so, Palestine has sort of invited us to a different party than the one you're describing. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that contradiction between the image that you're presenting us and the one that we've seen over the last month of uprising.
I really struggle with this question. Watching everything that was going on I'm in New York right now, watching the news or looking at Twitter constantly. And I ended up looking at these kind of fantastical promises that are being made for Palestinians and to Palestinians, and sort of the presentation of forms of aspiration and forms of attainment, and ended up sort of making this argument that like language like occupation couldn't really capture what we are seeing now. And I'm pretty critical of a lot of the literature that sort of focuses really narrowly on violence and resistance, and sort of ends up looking for micropolitics. And it's really strange to talk about now when the primary thing we're seeing is violence and resistance. And I think that what my research can sort of contribute to that sort of a discussion is that I think building up, real estate development, economic stability for the elites, possibilities for accumulation, stuff like that, in and around Ramallah is part of like the sort of geographical amortization of violence. It's part of what allows what's going on in Jerusalem and Gaza to occur. The most clear-cut example and well known is, the building up and sort of relative stability of Ramallah is part of, what the sort of Israeli settler colonial state geographical logics it enables them to sort of push people out of Jerusalem through all these sort of explicitly violent and also legally subtly violent mechanisms. And I think that what's happening there, what I'm talking about in terms of economic stability, potentials for sort of ongoing security for people through class aspiration, is the flip side of what we're seeing now in Jerusalem and Gaza and elsewhere inside. I mean, you, Shireen, did a talk the other day with Nadia Boulhaj and Bashir Abu Minna. And one of the things you all were talking about, and I think this was Bashir's language, is he made the argument that we're seeing resistance inside Palestine and in Gaza, specifically because they're not what he called the Oslo territories. And I think that, if he's right about that description, what I'm talking about is the links between what we might understand as the Oslo territories and the rest of it. So we all know that there's fragmentation of the body politic, fragmentation that's like material, fragmentation that's ideological or cultural or what have you. It's on the basis of class and possibilities. And I think that I'm exploring that, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so in a way, it's this initial party of promising returns, right? Not in the sense of the right of return, but these contained returns that sort of Rawabit itself symbolizes in its containment spatially. So I know we didn't talk about this quite yet in our previous conversations, but maybe you could just lay out Rawabi a little bit for people who don't know about it, and give us a sense to specifically around the spatial argument at that level.
Sure. So, when I first went to Palestine for this research, I knew that I wanted to study. I had all these questions about political economy, and specifically what different groups on the basis of class, in particular in Palestine, were doing to make Palestine, or to set up Palestine, to set up the Palestine that they wanted, or the Palestine in which they would like to intervene. And when I was there and starting the research, this massive real estate development called Rawabi sort of pierced the public consciousness. It was the star of these investment conferences. There were big, there were architectural renderings and models and things like this, and it became this huge topic of conversation. And what it is this massive housing development, privately funded housing development for eventually something like 40,000 people. About 10. I'm sorry, I seen the news ticker. The for eventually 40,000 people or so, like 10 kilometers north of Ramallah, 9 point something kilometers north of Ramallah, and it struck me. First of all, it was interesting because everybody was talking about it, and around that time, it started to show up in ads or in TV ads in the fancy supermarkets in Ramallah. And then, they started putting street signs all the way from Ramallah to Bir Zayt to past it. And, I think this is how I put it in the book, but yeah, it pierced the public consciousness in a way, and it became this topic of conversation, and then struck me immediately as a place to cite all of the things that I want to see: influx of foreign capital, privatization, sort of private forms of urbanization, and the explicit attachment of class aspiration and debt through this project. So I talked to real estate developers and finance capital people. I looked at how through this project, the PA is changing laws and possibilities around land tenure. So through this massive project, for the first time, land has clear enough title that it can be used for collateral. This excites people in banks and in NGOs who want to do lending, because now all of a sudden they can sort of grow a mortgage market in a way that didn't previously exist. So I traced all the connections that this thing was sort of creating and showing off. This thing being Rawabi, and but I also I feel a little bit defensive because I ended up being and there's Kareem, he's the Rawabi guy or whatever, and the truth is I don't I don't really care about it that much. Like it's the object of my study because I think it's a place to see all these things that I find really important to look at, and that have, I believe, bearing on possibilities in Palestine in a lot of ways. But yeah, that's what Rabie is, and I guess I want to say sort of like there's huge amounts of investment. Sorry, I should have said earlier. A lot of the funding comes from the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Qatar. So it started off. I think they were saying it was going to cost $500 million. Now it's probably something more like $1 billion or $1.5 billion that this project costs. And there is a huge amount of like practical and ideological and political support and financial support to things like this. And one of the things, just to go back to the question about Jerusalem, is I started to wonder, like, is this the moment? Could this be the moment when all these sort of focused investments in market building and spatialization of class might fail? And I mean, I don't. That's a question. I don't know the answer to it. Or I mean, if I'm right about the sort of what I see as the kind of orientation that these projects are taken, or if we'll see sort of the deepening of these dynamics under logics of like reconstruction, more accumulation at the top, more instability distributed through debt, through physically, spatially, through projects like this. And I wonder. I don't know the answer to those questions, but I think that, like, yeah, it's hard to talk about because all we're looking at and all we want to pay attention to is what's happening inside in Gaza. But I think that the ways that these things are linked, and I think that it's valuable to try and understand what those links mean in terms of Israeli governance over Palestine, Israeli, physical, geographical logics, and so on.
That's really useful. So, I mean, I'm going to ask you another question, another unplanned, because it's fun to just talk to you always. But if I understand you correctly, you're looking at Rawabi as a kind of microcosm for all of these, to observe all of these different phenomenon that you're interested in, financialization, investment, and so on. Can we think of the West Bank itself as a microcosm that your work helps us identify phenomenon from that we could think about beyond Palestine?
Well, I think
In
that
other words, what would you want other people working on political economy to what lessons are there that you have to teach us and that Palestine has to teach us?
the second part of that question, I think, is easier to answer. I mean, what I have to teach us is less interesting than what Palestine has to teach us. I think that let me put this in kind of like a pretentious academic way, which is that I think that I argue against a lot of the ways that it's been written about as like a sort of a world historical exception. And I think that that's like now sort of loads of people are saying that. Maybe that wasn't the case 10 years ago. All our friends sort of believe that to be the case. And I think that's right. That it's not really true that it's this really case unlike anywhere else. I mean, in some ways it is, but that's not the thing that makes it. And so what I think is that Palestine has a lot of attributes that are uniquely visible, but they're general attributes, right? Or at least in this case. I mean, what we're talking about is we're talking about like neoliberal state formation. We're talking about like changes in land tenure to accommodate privatization and private development. We're talking about elite accumulation. We're talking about the cultures around like, debt financing and class aspiration. I think those things are I mean, I don't want to use the word universal, but I'll say like not specific to Palestine. And so I think that that's the kind of way that I want to talk about it. And part of it is the academic argument, which is like, look, actually, this is a way to sort of help us understand, you know, capitalism in Palestine, or help us to understand like is what is being created there at a different scale, at the scale of state institutions, the simultaneous like erosion of the state and building up of the state through massive sort of infrastructures of privatization. Um, yeah, and so I think that's what I would say is that I think that Palestine shows us a lot of how things like state building occurs, or debt, or the spatialization of class. I mean, I think that's sort of what I'm trying to demonstrate there.
Totally. And I mean, this is one of the reasons that I bring this up too, because this is one of the things that's most exciting for me about your work, and especially within this context of the Political Economy Institute. I think that often people come to the study of political economy in Palestine or in the Middle East as somehow a place to implement theories, the meta theories that we have. And I think one of the things that you invite us to do is think of Palestine as a place to produce theory. As I think you put it really well, which is I think all of us who study Palestine have to wrestle with identifying the specificity, but then also thinking through what is it here, what is happening, what are the phenomenon happening here that are so much more visible, as you just put it, that allow us to see these intersections. And one of the things that I am, um, you know, one of the many things that I find so inspiring about this book is precisely how seriously you take the state. Um, and I was hoping that you would talk a little bit about what tools can you give us to think about state power in the absence of political sovereignty, and what challenges did you face to think of how are you able to take the state seriously in this specific context?
Well, how do I take the state seriously in this context? Let me try and see if I can find an answer that sort of also talks about this the point you just made about the intersections and commonalities with other contexts, because I do want to say like it is also I mean it's an academic project, and like my goals are like very very simple in that regard, which is like I think that there's sort of an undertold story here that might help us sort of understand what's going on in Palestine. But the other one is like I think that one of the problems with sort of treating Palestine as though it has no commonalities with other places is like is a potential political problem. And I think that like one of the possibilities that might allow us how do I say this? I think that like thinking about commonalities, common geographies, common phenomenon like class stratification and capital accumulation are like potential topographies of solidarity and commonality in other situations. And I mean, I think that like that runs through a lot of different ways of trying to think about Palestine, whether it's in terms of debates that are happening now, about like languages of indigeneity or settler colonialism, but also I think the sort of like topographies of class and capital. And so I guess how do I take the state seriously? I mean, I'm not expecting anybody. Um, I think that what is how do I take the state seriously? Sorry, I'm getting distracted. Um, I wanna. That was like another difficult thing to think about while writing and doing research, which is that I don't really want to write a checklist or like a political science thing about how this is or isn't a state. But what I wanted to do was very simple, which was to look at all of these sort of ensemble of projects that the PA and private developers and all their sort of allies and constituents and various levels of government were calling state building. So like, what does it mean for this thing to be called state building? What is it doing to organize all of these different interventions through the language and logics of state building? And so in that respect, I mean, the first part is like, you know, we were talking about it a little bit in the research seminar yesterday or today, which is like, you start to do field work and you go and you start to like, you have all these conceptions and you sit down with somebody and it's like Kareem sits down and he's like, neoliberalism, this, that, and the other thing, state, and people are like, what are you talking about? Get out of here. This makes no sense. And I think that, I heard over and over when I would say, the state, the things about the state or the state building project, people say there's no state building project. There's no such thing as the state in Palestine. Like, why are you even looking at this? But I think the first question is really simple, is really straightforward. It's like, okay, well, what do they think they're doing and what are they doing? And how is it state-like? And then I think it sort of leads to other questions about like the scale of governance or the scale at which a state can organize accumulation or projects like Rabie, which is huge, or the finance sector that they're trying to build up through this new, like, beginning with the interventions in land tenure, stuff like that. So I mean, I think that I also want to look at this thing as a state. I don't want to say it's not a state or it's some kind of a state or it's a truncated state or whatever, but like what it is to call, like in what ways is it meaningful to call the thing that the PA is building up in the West Bank a state, and what can it do? And I think that one of the things it can do is it can organize investment and accumulation at a completely different scale than it would be able to do otherwise. And I think that, I'm trying to kind of toggle between what's happening up here and what's happening down here and sort of try and understand the relationship between the two. Was that at all an answer to the question?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of also the debate in Lebanon where everyone's always like, when it dawle, there's no state, there's no state. And then there are people saying, no, actually there is a state, and this is precisely how it's functioning, right? Has been Ziad Abu Rish's argument, and kind of in a parallel way, sort of the financial catastrophe that is Lebanon now, that is being staged as this big anomaly, but it's actually a place to learn from that makes visible the things that are happening in many different places, but looks so exceptional because it's in this immense crisis. So, yeah, I mean, I think this question of state power is one, whether it's aspirational in the making or in the process of becoming, was one of the things that just drew me so much to your work, and kept me so excited until the book came out. The other thing that I love about this work that really changed my life was your invitation. What? Yes, we know you don't like compliments, Kareem. But the other thing that I love about this work that then sort of really informed my own thinking was also about temporality and the way that you talk about, planning despite the future, not for it. And I just wanted to see if you might want to say a few words about that, how you came to that realization, what it meant to you, like what does it mean when you are working with urban planners and investors who are planning despite the future?
It's so interesting um, that sticks out to you. It also, that's also something that our dear mutual friend Mesna Kato also has commented. She also, bless her, she also read the manuscript in early stages. That also stuck out to her, and I think for me, it's one of those things that didn't seem that it was like it wasn't foregrounded until you told me that it was. I kind of didn't realize that it was foregrounded in that way until somebody else sort of showed that to me. And I think that it's a nice question coming after the previous one, because it is also just like the way that I wanted to look at the state as a process, not a thing, or these interventions as processes, not things. And so, I look at, planners, or, these real estate developers who are presenting this image of what's possible. And I think that, like, one of the things that they used to talk about in terms of state building and the state project in Palestine, and I don't think they use this language as much anymore, but they're planning for the day after occupation. But the thing is that, like, nobody really seriously believes that we will achieve that. I mean, they do. I mean, these people who are doing these projects, or maybe that's not the right way of putting it, because people do have political hope, even people I disagree with politically. But, like, I think how do I put it? The projects, I don't, like, believe are implying or suggesting that they don't require the day after for success. So something like Rawabi doesn't require the day after for success. So then the next and obvious question is, well, what are they formalizing in the present? And so I started to trace that out in terms of, like, well, number one, obviously they're working within the normal conditions of the relationship of the West Bank to Israel, and building things and accumulating and stabilizing things. And so that seems very presentist in a way, but, like, organized in terms of logics of the future. But then the future thing also gets really, really complicated, because I remember when I first started talking to potential buyers in Rawabi or projects like it. The bulk of my research was, I lived in Ramallah in 2009 and 2010, and we're talking about just after the financial crisis. And I was talking to one of the sort of interviews that I cite at length here. I was talking to this guy, this really lovely guy, IT guy, who was talking about how much he wanted to move to Rawabi because it gave him the opportunity to think about life at 10 years and 20 years and 30 years through debt. And I was, like, really blown away by that, because I said to him, I was like, we're experiencing all this stuff from last year, this sort of, like, financial meltdown that started with, debt, mortgage instruments. And he was like, no, it's sort of like, it allows him to like stabilize his situation, put his family in a place, and think, like, essentially, like, have a plan for the next 30 years through the mortgage. And I think that that's one of the things that really interested me about that, is, like, the reshaping of future possibility through, building up places, or financial arrangements, financial relationships with one another. So I think that, and then, and where I come down on it is, I mean, me, is, like, pessimistic, obviously, about the sort of, like, formalizing these logics in the present. So the I guess the one other thing I want to say about that is, that's why, like, I just said that I'm not really, like, explicitly that interested in Rawabi. But the thing is, it's important that it's, like, a place where people are actually going to live. It's important that, like, it exists. It formalizes relationships of, like, lands and capital, but also, like, put, families live there, or will live there eventually. There aren't very many people living there now, I don't think. And that's also, this isn't really an answer to your question, but that's also where the critique gets really complicated, because, some people look at things like this, or look at the aspiration of people like the man I just mentioned, and sort of, like, essentially, like, treat them as being bamboozled or something. And I think that the promise of stability and certainty is very real and meaningful and appealing to people. And that's also where the sort of future orientation stuff comes in. I think people, not everybody has the stomach for the struggle in the same ways, and I don't mean that they're, like, accommodationist or something. I mean, like, people make decisions based on their circumstances and their family and their politics, and the presentation of a place like Rawabi that says explicitly, like, this is about stability, this is not about politics, this is about family, stuff like that, I mean, is appealing to people. And that's real, that's significant.
No, absolutely. And I think this point, there's so many rich things to think about with what you just said, but one of them is that comes directly to mind is, how ironic it is that it's a mortgage that makes you feel like you can plan ahead, right? It's debt that makes you visible in a particular way, and that kind of structures the possibility of planning or even the idea of a future on the one hand. But on the other hand, this point that you made sort of in the beginning about some of these investors and even planners who aren't expecting the day after. So it's a kind of planning for as much stability as you can in the present at a kind of, and I think here the question of scale is such an important one in thinking about Palestine today. And this is something you and I talk about. Not all the time, but we talk about a lot, which is, how the question of scale and the kind of daily struggles that people have kind of come out onto the scene in these spectacular moments, like in this last month of uprising, but then fall out of everybody's vision. And I think one of the things that your work invites us to do politically is precisely to take seriously people's deep desires for a place to live with their families, a mortgage, a kind of debt that makes like the next 10 years, I know what I'm going to be doing. But I guess my question there sort of gets us back to the initial couple of questions about, is it this logic then that can help us understand the um, relatively more quiet West Bank in comparison to Gaza, 48, and East Jerusalem in this last month. And I see your dog. Yay!
This is my beloved dog Ginger.
Ginger is much loved. So yeah, I
Um,
mean, how do I feel like you're saying, like, look, you can't expect people to be in resistance like all the time. Sometimes people just have to have a home and a family and that this is, but I'm also thinking through those logics in terms of, what are how do they also work in the medium term in conversation with now this kind of groundswell of opposition and a seemingly more unified call for Palestinian liberation.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the one thing I want to say is like, yeah, it is. I guess you can't expect people to be in constant resistance, but like, I mean, these kinds of questions get really tricky, and become like a personal thing or a diaspora thing, and I think that's not really up to me to decide. I don't really have anything to say about that for that reason. It's not up to me. But I think that like one of the things, again, that's important about this being an actual place is that it is sort of creating sites where, like, in terms of the image, but also like the reality of the place, like different kinds of aspiration are permissible and possible. And I think that that's like, I don't think that like the West Bank has become like a real like Rabie or something. But I think that like the sort of like that's the sort of the process that's happening there, the sort of direction things are going there, and again, sort of like at the expense of possibilities for like a normal, stable life in Jerusalem. I think that's yeah, that's like you put it. I mean, that's where the sort of the scale of the relationship between the two places becomes really relevant, and also like explicitly again why I don't want to just talk about um, differences or fragmentation as though they're a done deal, but like the sort of way that they're all intertwined. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think so too. I mean, I think that the other part of it is also about the intense fragmentation within the West Bank, right? And that long delay process that we've seen since 1993 that has made political mobilization spatially so much more difficult. Like, and even sort of what Ramallah itself means has changed in the last decade, never mind the last 2 decades since Oslo, like even in the last decade. And I think this kind of shrinking, the incredibly shrinking Palestine, like, and the way that you opened it up to the shrinking and the expanding. And I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, again, I'm thinking about this in broader terms because this is what, I do think that Palestine and your work have lessons for us, because now I think that many of us who didn't necessarily have to worry about, is it a certainty that what my life that what I expect my life to be, for example, in October, is going to be what I imagine. Like, now we have been subject to a global pandemic that can bring everything that we know to a halt. And I think this has been an incredible kind of approximation for what life under Israeli apartheid rule looks like, and only in the sense of, I actually don't know what's going to happen in October. I have no idea. I cannot in any way plan for it. I can have multiple plans that will be contingent on what the conditions on the ground are, and I feel like those are the lessons that we get from your work and your and the people that you study. So yeah. Um, and I always think about this in terms even of Birzeit, right? When I speak to my colleagues who write there and, who work there, and my friends, and they say, um, that the student body has changed tremendously because of all the people that can't get to the university, right? So I think that again, we're thinking about this happening in the West Bank and then in Palestine as a whole. And yeah. Well, what
You know,
about if we
I just
go
want
ahead?
I want to say one thing just about that. I was thumbing through and I couldn't find it, but I thumbing through this, but I somewhere quote Rada Karmi, who's talking about this and talking about going back to Ramallah, and just she makes the point that like it's just one of fewer and fewer places where a Palestinian life is permissible, or it's possible to live life that seems somehow Palestinian. And I think the implications are like not under the sort of like constant threat or these fucking people moving into your house or whatever. And I think that that's one of the reasons that like Ramallah and places around it are sort of expanding and looking in this way, and not just against in contrast to Jerusalem or Gaza, but also other cities in the West Bank. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, Ramallah often reminds me of what it used to be like to be in Beirut in different moments of upheaval, which is like people's deep desire to just have normal lives in the middle of, like a really expansive repression. Like, no, we're going to go out and have drinks or smoke shisha or whatever we want to do. We're going to have mashawi, and this is our decision, right? So yeah, there is that kind of deep desire for the ordinary, in a context where the ordinary is impossible. So yeah, I think that that's you know, again, a very powerful kind of insight into all of our present. Whenever there are a lot of people who at the beginning of the pandemic were sort of rushing to, saying things like, "Oh, I just can't wait for things to go back to normal," and it's like the normal is gone. That is actually the opportunity, right? That the normal as we know it is gone, and now we can reshape a normal. Um, So, yeah.
And
Well,
it's
I want to
also,
ask you, no, go ahead.
well, no, I mean it's also like the thing from Kotami. I mean, it's also like it's very strange. I mean, my experience is different from yours, obviously, but like Ramallah is by far the place I know the best in Palestine. It's the place that I lived. It's not Yazud, where my family is from. It's not even Jerusalem, really. And so I think that that's also part of the like we're talking about like fragmentation and stuff that's permissible, but like in real material, concrete ways. I'm not making like some brilliant argument or something. Like that's just how it works. That's where a lot of people go back to. A lot of people who sort of have different kinds of relationships to Palestine or don't have family there anymore, and so on. Like me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I had a different center of gravity because
Yeah.
my spouse has,
Yeah.
has is a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship. So my center of gravity was Haifa, and I would go from Haifa to Ramallah or from Haifa to Nablus, and it was always so just fascinating to think about the different Palestines in all of these places, their continuities with the past, and then their deep ruptures, and the way that, and I think it would be interesting to think, like with people like Himmat Zarbi, who are thinking about Haifa in the present in conversation with Haifa in the past, sort of the way that so many, cultural producers, you know, uh, theater, poetry, literature, the club scene, the queer scene, how Haifa's sort of anonymity in a sense, that people can be there, but not necessarily it's distinct from Nazareth, let's say. So it was just, for me, it's always interesting to travel and see these different Palestines. But yeah, I mean, I think Ramallah is the address, right, for a lot of people, as you said, who don't have family in Palestine anymore. Yeah. So I want to ask you about another thing that we have talked a lot about, which is this binary between occupation and resistance, which it feels like. I mean, the first question is the language of occupation is exceeded by the conditions on the ground. What I mean is, what's happening on the ground, occupation just isn't enough to describe it anymore, right? And the other point which you sort of started out with, which is this like occupation resistance binary as itself also not sufficient to understand the conditions on the ground. So how does your work help us understand that proliferation of extreme violence from the Israeli state that we've seen, but also like these waves of resistance and different modes of resistance?
I mean, I'm interested in what you have to say about that. So I'll just say, I guess pretty quickly. I mean, my answer to this is similar to my answers to other things. I mean, I think that the violence and resistance part is like predicated on the stabilization or stability, relatively speaking, elsewhere. I mean, I think that that's one thing that I sort of really want to insist upon, and also as a way of sort of like relinking fragmented parts of Palestine. I guess like I mean, one of the things that I think that this is also hard because so when we have conversations like this, we're talking about categories with meanings or specific sets of meanings or like academic things or legal categories or what have you. And I think that you're right. And this is something that you pushed me to clarify in the manuscript also. Thank you. That like, I mean, what are we actually talking about? And like, is does occupation explain more than it obscures? And I think you're right that it probably doesn't. Um, So, I mean, I think that I would start to say stuff like, I think the Zionist geographical imperative is predicated on, uh, making life impossible to live as a Palestinian person. And I think that has a lot of different meanings. Like, it could be physical, it could be cultural, it could be assimilationist, and it might be occupation, it might be apartheid, it might be ethnic cleansing, it might also be sort of like building up zones of stability. I think all these things are tied together, and I think that like yeah, I think that it would probably be, if I was trying to find like what's the core of it, I think that it would be a set of imperatives, like from our perspective. I mean, a set of imperatives that are like necessitate, how do I say this? Yeah, necessitate the impossibility. That's a bad sentence, but of living life as a Palestinian in Palestine. I think something like that. And so yeah, so then we start to see class stratification. We start to see forms of identity changing. One of the things that I think that like is tied to the promise of aspiration is the potential to also change politics around aspiration. Away from like a national politics to or liberation politics towards like a class aspiration politics. And again, I don't think that's unique to Palestine, and I don't think that's like damning in any way. It's pretty common. It's pretty straightforward. But I think that that's one of the things that like the proliferation of places where that's allowed has a bigger capacity for social change or something. But I mean, what do you think about this question of like, yeah, occupation and how it does or doesn't, the way you put it was understand the proliferation of extreme violence and resistance. I mean, what's your position on
No,
that?
I mean, I don't know either. I mean, I feel like, I feel like your work teaches us about the potential of class aspiration and also its limits. And I feel like what we're witnessing, at least, is this kind of experiment with a basic minimum of the ordinary that might be enough, but at the same time, my concern about the terminology is, do we have one term that can explain all of the different fragmented sites of Palestinian experience and struggle in Palestine? And I think our search for a term, or the way, settler colonialism, apartheid, occupation, siege, second class citizenship, annexation, all of these different kinds of categories and techniques and strategies are some of the things that we have to balance analytically. So there's like an analytical fragmentation that we have to deal with as we try to imagine a kind of political future that thinks about all of Palestine, if that makes sense. So I don't, it's something I keep thinking about myself.
I mean, maybe the problem is just that we need to give up trying to find a word for it, or a single word for it. That might be the answer. You know?
That's right. I think that's
So,
right. Because, yeah, I mean, like when people are like, oh, and the occupation, I'm like, "Oh, okay, yes, but, and, that's one part of it. But yeah, I think we have to proliferate the terms, just as the like political techniques of dispossession themselves are proliferating and um, continue to proliferate. And I think for me in this last month, that's what's been so moving, is the kind of light that people are shedding on these different sites of dispossession, including inside the Green Line, right? So yeah, those are some of the kinds of ways that people themselves are pushing us to make sure that we avow all these different logics. So I
yeah.
know that our fellows from the Institute are watching, and I want to encourage you all to write in questions on Facebook for Kareem, and I will be getting them on my text on my phone and handing them over to him. So while you all think of your questions, I'm going to give you just a basic research question that I think will be useful to our wonderful fellows. So, can you tell us a bit about? I mean, you've already kind of drawn on the research that you've done, but maybe you could tell us the more about the interworking of your object of study and methodology. How did those two things intersect? How did they inform each other as you were doing your research?
I mean, I'm going to say something related to the previous question and maybe try and back into this method question, which is like, I think that, yeah, I think that maybe the answer is just we need to stop looking for a single sort of terminology or just give up or actually not give up, just like stop caring and stop thinking that matters. But I do think that like one of the things that, like one of the big debates right now is whether sort of indigeneity or settler colonialism, like which captures this better. And I think that like what those debates are showing are like we're talking about like logical coherence, and I think that like that's one of the things that I think about when I that I believe I saw when I think about like what's the Zionist geography of the West Bank, or like how to understand this sort of like overlapping of Palestinian sites for accumulation and Zionist geography or what have you. Research. How did I sort of the interlocking of the object of study and the analysis? Is that what you said? Like, I think that, well, I'm trained as an anthropologist and a human geographer, right? Sort of simultaneously. And I think that, the struggle for me was to figure out how to toggle between data from people, whether it was sort of studying up and talking to people in their official capacities as real estate people or finance capital people or NGO people, and but also the sort of conceptions of life or future possibility, but like what that has to do with phenomenon at sort of more general scales. And that was just always my struggle, was trying to figure out how those things intertwined. And so like there are various kinds of literatures that help me sort of understand the relationship between some of those things. So like ideas about social reproduction, which is sort of necessarily about the context and capitalism, and how it bears upon life and possibility, you know, social organization and culture. And I think that was why I sort of ended up doing a lot of things, interviewing. I look at like newspapers and stuff like that. Um, More kind of spatial analysis stuff. Um, yeah, but the object of my study, yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. I should have thought of like a way to answer this question without floundering around in it. But I think that like for me, it's about sort of toggling back and forth between scale, like analytical scales and research scales, and trying to understand the relationship between like life and place and phenomena that exist beyond them. Because I don't think it's at all possible to understand one without the other. There's just even if it were true, it's certainly not true in Palestine, where like the questions are necessary about like state politics, international aid, funding from elsewhere, and class stratification and accumulation, stuff like that. There's no possible way to ask a question about life in Palestine that's constrained to just Palestine. Or that's not a good way of putting it. Constrained just to the sort of like specific locale things that are happening in the moment. I mean, it's all tied to phenomenon that go far beyond the local. There's
Um,
actually, if you press the button, we can see these chats. So hello,
oh,
Phil.
really? Oh, here we go.
Yeah, there's a
Got it.
question from Maya. Is that what you're seeing?
Okay, so we have a Maya Wind question. Thank you both, Kareem and Shireen, for this conversation. My question for Kareem: you touched on this earlier, but I'm curious to hear more about how the spatial and temporal logics of projects like Rabie intersect with Palestinian imaginations and theorizations of decolonization.
Not much. I mean, I don't. I don't mean that to be glib. I mean, like, I think this is like I think that that's a really similar question to the sort of future orientation stuff. I mean, I think the projects of real estate development or market development or things like that are just about a different kind of an imagination of what Palestine would look like or could look like. I wouldn't say decolonized, but like with I guess the problem with projects like that is that they operate on the fantasy that like economy and politics can be decoupled, or that you can do something in Palestine without Israel. I think that's it. So I think that like I don't think that projects like that are doing decolonization, but I don't think they're talking about decolonization either. I mean, that's certainly not language that like people who are guaranteeing loans and people who are making real estate projects use. I think that like how it intersects the image of maybe it's just that the image of decolonization implied in projects like this is simply this vague and impossible day after. Maybe that's it. I don't.
No, I think that that's such a powerful kind of articulate. This question of the day after, um, which is in itself that logic of deferral, something that also happens within decolonial movements as well, right? And that's what people are pushing against, which is no, we're not going to wait until revolution to deal with our problems. Actually, we have to deal with those difficult questions now, because if we wait for the day after, we won't be the same people, right? We're going to just continue holding. So there's a tension, I think, between um, what that kind of labor around holding the possibility of the day after in our imaginations as out there, as aspirational, as most likely not going to happen, so we survive in the present. And also that's the space in which people are able then to create these kind of really limited kinds of aspirations. Like, yes, you can buy a place in Rawabi, and you would be able to imagine 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, but that doesn't mean that you'll be able to imagine much more than that. You know what I mean? It's still a kind of confined set of aspirations that are kind of relying on this static day after that will never come.
I mean, I think also like I think very, very like practically as a person, and I mean, I think that if we're thinking practically, like a project to stabilize the present is not asking for decolonization. It's not doing decolonization. That's not its goal. It's stabilizing the present, or it's like it's too determined or informed by the relations of the present, and that's the sort of ground or the sort of temporality or practical project it has is the present, and that's not decolonization, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, and I think your first point is so well taken, which is that projects like these are so dependent on this premise that you can divorce the economic from the political, and we know that that's never a possibility, no matter what Palestinian capitalists will tell us, either in the present or historically. And there's a history of Palestinian capitalists saying, no, actually, we can divorce the political from the economic, and we know that that is not the case. So, yeah,
I want
absolutely.
to. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
I'm wondering, like, I mean, how did you find it? How did you find the reception? I mean, my work is brand new, but like, how did you find the reception of your work, which is you're talking about a population of people that is not really studied or talked about or acknowledged? I mean, as a group, but also for precisely this reason of like, we just don't really talk that much about class and about Palestinian capitalists and capitalism. I mean, how did you sort of like navigate those bigger political questions?
I mean, I think it's interesting the way that people continue until now, really, to ask. Like, usually, people in Palestine either will feel sometimes we'll feel really seen and like, yes, there is this history. Oops, I don't know why. Yes, there is this history, but we aren't necessarily, there's a kind of relief around narrating a history that has been made absent. But on the other hand, there's also a certain amount of put like there's a challenge. People will say, well, the people will say would say to me, look, these people didn't exist, and if they existed, there were very small numbers, so they didn't matter. And I'll say, no, well, not quite. Look at all of the things that have lived on, that were Palestinian initiatives. And then people would say, well, they were all compradors and collaborators, so they don't matter. Well, that's not exactly true either. Some of them were, some of them weren't. Well, they failed, so it doesn't matter. Okay, if we're not going to study anything that failed, that's going to really limit what we study. But yeah, I mean, I think that there is this real kind of, at times, people are very happy to think about a Palestinian middle class, and at other times, it's still confined by these ideas of, um, collaboration, or that somehow capitalism or capital transformation was something that the Europeans brought in. And actually, we know from a much longer tradition of political economy that it's a more complicated story. So, and I think it gets kind of back to the question that you raised around settler colonialism and indigeneity, which is, how do we, even with these terms, complicate and bring in the historical specificities of this place? And I feel like at each turn we're sort of doing that, and I think that's why it's a really such a rich place to theorize from. Okay, Robert has a question, and it says, "Thank you both for this great talk. Kareem, do you see parallels here with other development projects planned cities in the region, such as Neom and EOM in Saudi Arabia, or Mustad in the UAE, or even in other ways, Israeli planned settlements a few kilometers away from Rabwabi?"
Uh, I mean, I don't know the answer to that question because I don't know enough about. Neom is the really long one, I think. And then I read Gunel's book about Mustard, I believe, right? But I think that like let me talk about the settlements, because that's one of the sort of predominant critiques of Rawabi is it looks like a settlement. It's this aesthetic of settlements, and then that critique sort of continues on to talk about how it's like clashing with uh, Palestinian vernacular, ideas of Palestinianness, Palestinian histories, stuff like that. And I think that argument is fine. It's not wrong, but I think that it doesn't get at what this project does. And that's sort of my main interest, is like, what is this project doing? What are the changes that it's uh, enabled by, that it implies, and that it creates in its wake? And so I think that some of these projects, for sure, they're about like, certain forms of investment in the landscape. They might also change land tenure. They might also be about, I don't know, construction industries or whatever. Muzdad, if I'm not mistaken, also is empty. I think. Well, it's too bad Robert can't have this conversation with us directly, but so I won't talk about it because I don't remember. But I think that, yeah, the thing about settlements is like, I think one of the commonalities is that Israelis developed settlement built, not developed, but they sort of like are the sort of have developed in the sense that they have like a well-developed project of doing building as a form of land defense. That's what sort of Paul Colbry talks about this, and I think that Rawabi does have elements of that because they talk about it in that way, and they say, it's going to be about territorial contiguity. It's about sort of keeping land in Palestine, Palestinian. But also the thing about Rawabi is that with one small sliver of it as an exception, it's in A with a little bit of B, and so it's already sort of built in and through these land regimes that encircle Palestinians. And so I think that the idea that it's about land defense is not super convincing because of where it is. But I think that all of these sort of big projects are about fixed capital, about sort of building in the environment, and then have certain kinds of like new or supposedly new implications for social life through them. I mean, I was talking to one of my old professors a couple weeks ago because we were going to do a talk together, and so he's writing a book. He does work on the Grundrisse, and he was talking about like this this point that Marx made or implied in the Grundrisse about like a time when fixed capital becomes its own end, divorced from production, or at least in the Palestinian case, divorced from national production and security and social reproduction, because in this context those things are structured by Israel and Israeli imperatives. And so I think that like one of the ways that I would not answer your question, Robert, but like ask the next question is like what are the relationships between fixed capital and to what extent can we see it as its own end? And I think that's a really good question because one of the things I talk about in my book is how this project in particular is backed by international aid. So it's different from, again, I don't know those two projects well, but it's different from like an ordinary development project in an ordinary context because the developers aren't at tremendous risk. Like they're all their projects are insured and backed by loan guarantees, by actual money that might be coming from other states, in this case the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Qatar. And so I think that the question would be, how are they linked in terms of what they're doing and the capital investment part. I swam around in there a little bit, but maybe there's a gesture towards an answer.
No, I think that's really powerful, right? Because it's like, again, you can see it in conversation with these other sort of development projects and so on. But again, to get back to the specificity and here, the question of aid is, I think, a really crucial one. Okay, from Amr, thank you both for such a wonderful and rich session. You've given us much to unpack. Question. It is appealing to lament how market conceptions of freedom are the only alternatives present in lieu of ones based in rights, dignity, and land. But how useful of a lens is this to deploy? Should it be complicated further? Uh, Appealing to lament how market conceptions of freedom are the only alternatives. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand, but maybe you do.
I wonder, is it me who's lamenting them? Or, I mean, I guess I do.
Yeah, that's what I was. I was like, I don't think we're
You're not,
lamenting it, but yeah.
I mean, you're not wrong about that. Um, but I don't think that that's like, it's not my goal. I mean, that's why I'm sort of critical about this little Wabi as a settlement thing, because I don't think that's like the extent of the question, or like that's not productive enough of a question. So I don't want to just lament it. And in fact, I lament it because it's not the piece that I personally care about the most. But I explicitly, I think, don't lament it because I think I want to take really seriously people's ideas about their own possibility and their own class aspiration, and sort of treat that as real. and treat that not as a mistake, not as, at the very least, not something that's up to me to decide for them, you know. And so I think that yeah, I mean, personally, I lament it, but I also don't think that that's the lens that I'm deploying. Maybe it came off that way in this talk, but yeah, I don't think like, I mean, I'd be interested to know if that's how it sort of comes across when people read it. It might. I don't know. But I mean, I think, but that's not sort of my goal, or that's not my inclination. Is just to
Mhm.
lament that. It's to sort of understand it um, as productive and as something with material consequences. That's different. I mean, and again, like I'm. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, no. I'm so sorry. Please.
Oh, no, please. I want to hear from you.
No, no, I'm just, all I want to say is like, again, with the binary, like either it's like market forms of, and I don't think you talked about market conceptions of freedom. You were simply talking about, this idea of a kind of medium term stability, right? A 10-year period, a 20-year period, which is different from, I think, freedom as such, right? Like the kind of aspirations that you're talking about, at least, I mean, how I understood them in my own work, because I do think there are parallels in what we work on, which is basically like getting at, all right, well, how do people feel about money? And how do people feel about their relationship to money? And what kind of aspirations do they assign to profit? How do they link profit to progress? What does that mean? I think if we don't ask those questions, and not wrestle with what they mean to people, then we're actually missing out on a whole kind of a plethora of ways that people live their everyday life. So I think that my response to Hamid would be, I don't think I don't think it's the binary that you're setting it up as. I think market conceptions of aspirations and security and the future are things that we have to wrestle with as we imagine a kind of language that is thinking through the possibility of liberation. In other words, Rawabi doesn't give people ideas about or hopes for freedom. It gives them hopes for class aspiration, safety, and some kind of temporal holding place, right?
Yeah, stability. I think that's
Yes.
I was like trying to find a way to get there, and I think I think you put it well. That it doesn't give. It's like it might not be about freedom. I mean, like, but this is also complicated. Like, ominous question is really good. Is really good question. Really interesting one to think about. Because also, like, I mean, I say someplace in the book, like, yeah, obviously my sympathies are not with people who think that like debt is adequate to national liberation. Of course not. And I think that like we can talk about like, like Marx's false freedom to sell your labor on an open market is no freedom at all. But then there's, I cite somewhere, or like I think about it from time to time, like Neil Smith, who was my friend and my professor, talks about the empire. What is it? The freedom embedded in the empire of capital. And I think that that's like, it is a kind of freedom, and it is a kind of like conception, and it is like a productive geographical and worldwide imperial kind of a logic and project that makes things, that makes places, that makes relations. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in that, and not just lamenting it. Although, like, yeah, personally, in conversation, when we talk on the phone or whatever, yeah, I mean, I like, I do lament the sort of potentials for changing, for reorienting politics away from kinds of national politics towards, how do I say it, reorienting forms of aspiration, let's say. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, it's a really
Yeah,
good question.
and there's no way to reorient them if you don't know what the spectrum of them are, you know? Okay, Ahmed has responded to us. Thank you. That was very helpful. Also, I should clarify, I didn't mean to imply either of you are lamenting, exclamation. Rather, I'm responding to the narrative of economic coexistence that emerged as part of mainstream media's adoption of Fayyadism. By insisting on market freedoms, the narrative goes, Palestinians improved their quote unquote quality of life, thereby shrugging occupation rights, dignity, and land under the rug. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
That clarifies everything.
No, Ahmed is right because that narrative is just not convincing.
Oh, yeah. I was
You
just
know,
going
yeah.
through the Journal of Palestine table of contents, and I came up across an interview with Fayyad that was talking about, a Palestinian state in sight in the next decade or something of this nature. And, I thought, my goodness. Like, did you really believe that when you said it? So anyway, okay, Stefa, thank you for the fantastic conversation, Shireen and Kareem. I'm thinking of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's argument that crisis is a moment of transformation whose outcome is determined through struggle. Do you think of the pandemic and or recent uprisings as these kinds of inflection points? What kinds of liberatory openings, if any, are you seeing in Palestine today? And how can Palestinians' justified desire for stability inform what liberation might look like?
Do you want to answer?
No. I want to hear you answer about Gilmore and yeah.
I mean, I mean, not just the pandemic, but also what's been happening in the last few weeks and the increased visibility of, uh, Zionist violence in different parts of Palestine. I mean, I think that's also the sort of the moment of crisis. And like, you know, uh, I'm not like a very social media inclined person, but I mean, like, this is like there's really something really wonderful about being able to hear from people there directly. All these incredible young people. I think that I think with any moment of crisis, that is like the problem of, are we going to capitalize on it? And I think that that's sort of what I had in mind before when I said something about, like, I think I said it. Um, you know, will this be the moment of failure of all these investments in stabilization, or will we see the sort of like stabilization and economic development stuff emerge stronger through logics of like reconstruction, or ending this current conflict as though it were a discrete or limited kind of conflict? And I don't know the answer to that at all. I mean, and I think it's also really strange to be Palestinian, or be a diaspora Palestinian, and watch this stuff and feel hopeful when you see like stability chipped away at. Feel hope at like the way that people are experiencing like just the most like grotesque horrors imaginable. I mean, it's like it's dislocating and it's weird. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a lot of things that are new and unique, and I really hope that led by people there, and the rest of us can sort of capitalize on them. But I mean, I don't know. I have no idea. I think as far as the pandemic is concerned, like, I also at the sort of, you know, it seemed to me, and I was at the beginning of it, I was looking at the numbers a lot, and I was sort of trying to think about, there you start to hear these stories about the laborers who were getting vaccines or who weren't allowed back in, and all these Palestinian guys from the West Bank who were sleeping in construction sites because they couldn't move around, and how the pandemic was kind of like moving and being experienced there. And then once it went to the West Bank and Gaza especially, I mean, it turned horrible very quickly for obvious reasons. And I think that I was talking to Raja Khaldi, who's an economist, and he was pushing, and he was sort of hopeful that we would see like a change in the sort of like neoliberal orientation of PA towards like funding public services, like, because it became so obvious and so obviously necessary that there would have to be, uh, state services, state funding for social reproduction and health and stuff like that. And I guess I don't know if that movement really took. I mean, I think we can certainly say that it didn't take here in America at all, and so I don't know. I mean, I hope that this moment of crisis is an inflection point. I think it's way too early to know. I think that we've seen crises before. Um, yeah, but I mean, like what's I think embedded in that line from Ruthie Gilmore is like it's also a moment to feel hopeful, through the sort of, you know, in this case, like just visible horror that people are experiencing. I mean, I think that it is possible to chip away some kind of hope.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you so much about, I keep thinking in terms of, um, after the ceasefire and just kind of thinking through all the tremendous costs that particularly Palestinians in Gaza have to always weather. 9 families wiped out of the family registry records, right? You know, the case of families that basically 4 generations get destroyed in one strike in Gaza. It's such a tremendous cost, and it's incredibly dangerous to derive from that, especially at a distance. Hope. I do think that I mean, and add on to that, I think in terms of the pandemic, the vaccine apartheid that we saw, right, playing out in Israel proper versus the West Bank and Gaza, whereas at my university, the administrators were propping up the Israeli vaccine system as like the model that we should all aspire to. So that kind of status of like the model that people have to follow, the high tech, it's so oppressive. And to yet again be subject to watching the essentially massacring of people
Mhm.
in Palestinians in Gaza. Like that's what it is, right? So I hear you, and I think that that's a really, really important thing to hold on to and center. I do feel that this moment is a moment of inflection, an inflection point, and then the way that Ruthie Gilmore has talked about sort of it's the productivity of crisis, depending on how we guide it, although it's so incredibly fragile. You mentioned the diaspora. One of the things I think that this moment might be, at least how it feels for me, and this is just a personal reflection, is that there's something in this moment that feels to me as some kind of bookend in relation to Oslo. And the rest of us who were written out of Oslo, including the diaspora, right, are now like, no, no, we want our seat back at the table. Not that we ever kind of ceded that ground, but there's a way that this moment, I think, just as Bashir, as you had quoted him, we're talking was saying like the Oslo territories, right, and the way that the people kind of completely, utterly excluded from that have been able to unify. And I do think that the diaspora is part of that. And we have seen, I think, important initiatives and, struggles. But of course, I think we have to center the tremendous cost. I do think, though, I mean, I'm not optimistic, and um, I don't want to be like naive, but I do think that there is a tremendous potential in this moment. And I think it's precisely around the 2 decades of the erosion of U.S. empire that we've witnessed, the complete death of American exceptionalism with the election of Donald Trump, and everything that happened after that. And then also, but more importantly, now well over a decade of intensive popular struggle globally. Right? I mean, we are marking 10 years of the Arab uprisings. We are looking at a really powerful, sustained, movement for Black lives. We are looking at, also powerful indigenous struggles, right, from Standing Rock to Mauna Kea. And I do think that the Palestine and Palestinian struggle has been in conversation with, and envisioning and strategizing with these different movements and learning from them and also teaching. And I do think, for me, what gave me some hope was to look at the, labor struggle in Alabama and to hear how people were saying, BLM made this possible. And that was to me like a real moment of, wow, this is really exciting. This is a real possibility. So I'm not kind of counting I'm not like waiting that the revolution will happen in my lifetime, but I do think that this moment of immense crisis, parallel with really exceptional organizing, is something to derive some hope from.
Yeah, we're over time, but I just want to say, like, I think that, I mean, that pessimism is okay. Is like just a good is a potentially good thing to keep in mind, because just we have much more experience with crises not turning into revolutions than turning into revolutions. Like, you know, I think in practice, in Marx, but also in, like, Oslo was a solution
That's
to
right.
problems. Real estate development is a solution to problems, and so I think that, keeping in mind that, like, the outcome is obviously isn't preordained, but yeah, like, pessimism can be like a realistic way of thinking about, thinking about it hopefully. That's not a very good sentence, but, like, I mean, I think that, the we have more experience in failure than in success, and it's okay to remember that, um, and to look at this stuff both with hope and in a sober fashion. Something like
That's right. Well, I want to relay Amr's message, which is that he loves us both, and
that.
we love you too.
We love you too. Thank you.
And Gretchen says something about forensic medical experts could show people the sadism. And I think she's
Maybe for
talking
maybe for
about Gaza.
maybe for another conversation.
Yeah, and that's another conversation. Thank you so much, Kareem.
Thank
Everyone who's
you.
watching, please get this amazing book. It will inspire you and invite you to think in very exciting new ways. Thank you so much, Kareem.
Thank you. Thank you, Bassam and Shireen and Samit and everybody, and the participants in the Summer Institute, who I will continue to see tomorrow.
Thank you
Bassam, do you
both.
want to say something? Okay.
Thank you, Shireen, for a fantastic job at interviewing and bringing things out. I've always watched you do this and I learned from you. And thanks, Kareem, for enlightening us with very refined and sophisticated concepts and approaches that actually expand our horizons. I was taking notes, and I hope and I'm sure many were as well. Um, I will also. I would like to also say that those who are interested in the Political Economy Summer Institute can go to the website politicaleconomyproject.org, and you can go to the Summer Institute and look up the call for next year's edition, which will be coming out in the next few months in early fall. And if you're an educator and you have students who are interested in the topic, please send them that way. and we will see you all soon. We will have quite a bit of events coming up soon within the rubric of plural economy. And we also should mention that a book volume that came out of this project, of the plural economy project, came out this past year, this current year actually, from Stanford University Press, on critical political economy of the Middle East and North Africa, which includes 12 chapters that are well worth reading. So if you can also, if you'd like to check this out, it is also on our website. Is there anything else or any last words you would like to share, Shireen and Kareem?
No, just thanks to everybody for listening, and thanks to the organizers, and thanks as always to Shireen.
Shukran. And we will actually be posting right now a picture of the first class of Political Economy Summer Institute as we uh, bid farewell to everyone. Salam. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.